we have to take scripture as a whole, right? We don't want
Mhm.
to isolate a passage and say, this is the be all end all.
I have a section in the book where I talk about some of the misguided concepts around reconciliation in the church
Mhm.
today. And we have more reconciliation ministries than ever, and more peacemaking ministries than ever. And on one
Mhm.
level, I suppose you could say that's a good thing. On another level, though, I think people can get rushed into a reconciliation process that can be misguided and not helpful, particularly if the abusive leader is not repentant. If the abusive
Mhm.
leader is not repentant, what is the purpose of putting them in the same room with the victims? What is going to
Right.
happen? Well, the abusive leader will basically say, I didn't do anything wrong, and then it forces the victims to try to prove their case. And then he says, no, you're blowing it out of proportion, and the whole thing gets reopened again. You cannot reconcile with an unrepentant person. And so it's really the church's job to hold these pastors accountable. And what's sad is when the church doesn't hold an abusive pastor accountable, but still insists on reconciling them with the victims, then
Mhm.
wow, there's something really missing there.
Mhm.
And that I think is those are some of the things I tried to address in the book.
Yes, and with that, would you mind briefly going over Matthew 18 and what you would share with people about that? Because again, I've heard this from people too, is I didn't follow Matthew 18. So it's almost like they think now they have this, they went about the process wrong. And so the consequences are now on them because they didn't handle the
Oh
abuse the way
yeah,
they should have. And it's
I've
like,
seen
no,
this
no, no,
all
no,
the
no.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Matthew 18 obviously is a very important text for how we handle conflict in the church. What I remind people though is it's not the only text that talks about conflict in the church.
Mhm.
It's not an exhaustive text about conflict in the church. It's not a catch-all. It lays out very helpful principles for what I would argue are sort of normal personal offenses between people that you
Mhm.
want to see reconciled. But there's a number of ways it's been misused in cases of abuse. One of the ways it's been misused is if a person doesn't follow Matthew 18, they treat it almost like it's Miranda rights. Now you can't be charged with a crime because someone didn't follow the right procedure. Should
Mhm.
people follow Matthew 18 when it does apply? Of course they should, because it's a
Right.
biblical passage. But even if they mistakenly didn't follow Matthew 18 and didn't follow proper process, do you then ignore the abuse? That's just it's not the Miranda rights. It's
Mhm.
you can address both problems. Is what I tell people. You can address the abuse and remind the
Mhm.
person that Matthew 18 is there for a reason. The other thing I say about Matthew 18 is that there are limitations to it in terms of criminal behavior and even
Mhm.
in terms, I think, of abuse. If someone is abused, let's say sexually by their pastor, the idea that you should go back in a room with that pastor one on one and follow the Matthew 18
Mhm.
thing is, I think, a misunderstanding of the whole scenario. If I was a husband and my wife was sexually abused by a pastor, I would not let my wife go back into a room
Right?
alone with the person who sexually abused her.
Mhm.
And so we have to realize that there's boundaries and common sense limitations to this, and I think that needs more attention in the church.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I remember in the book, I'm not recalling exactly which passage it was. I don't know if you will recall offhand or not, but it was a comparison to, wasn't it just a couple of chapters later? Or then is there a parable used where
Yeah, it's in
they
the same chapter
circumvented?
actually of
Okay.
Matthew 18, where it's the parable of the unmerciful servant who doesn't forgive the debt that people owe him. And when people see him behave that way, they don't go confront him directly. They go to the master and say, "Hey, your servant here is mistreating people." And
Mhm.
so, and the reason they can do that is because Matthew 18 only applies to the person who's been offended. It doesn't mean you can't ever point out someone's sin in general without going to
Mhm.
them first. If I watch a pastor abuse someone else on church staff, I can go to the elders directly without even going to the pastor and
Mhm.
say, hey, he's mistreating staff. And that is not a violation of Matthew 18. And I think that's an important qualification too.
Mhm. Yeah, again, just a really important indication that we have to take scripture as a whole, right? We don't want to
Hmm.
isolate a passage and say, this is the be all end all. I was just having a conversation recently with someone about kind of the idea of is God a bully? And we see some things in the Old Testament where it's, oh, they killed everyone, but then 2 minutes later they're intermarrying. So obviously they didn't kill everyone, so we've got to keep reading. We have to piece these things together. And if we just take one passage and we isolate it, we're going to miss the big picture and do things like having sexually abused people meeting one-on-one with their abusers, which to those of you who are watching and listening, where maybe you're like, oh my gosh, does that actually happen? It does.
Oh my
Tragically, that
gosh,
does
yes.
actually happen.
In the
Yeah.
Bill Hybels case, I mentioned this in the book. In the Bill Hybels case, the women that he sexually mistreated were chided for not going directly to him
Mhm.
to follow Matthew 18. And that's an example of how churches
Mhm.
do this, because I think that it's misunderstand Matthew 18, and part of that is because no one's taken the time to really explore the implications of abuse on Matthew 18 and other types of scenarios that I think we need to evaluate. And like I said, the passage isn't trying to solve every problem the church ever comes across.
Right. Right.